If somebody hears about one of these projects and wants to replicate it, change it, do it in their own way, I encourage that 100%. Nobody needs to reach out to me to ask for my permission.
Hello and welcome to Art Restart, where we learn from artists who, wherever they work, whatever they make, are shaking up the status quo in their fields and in their communities. I'm Piercarlo Talenti, the producer and editor of this podcast, a production of the Thomas S. Keenan Institute for the Arts at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. In this episode, we'll be speaking with writer, visual artist, and community organizer Shanai Matteson. Shanai grew up in northern Minnesota's rural Aitkin County, but she left for the Twin Cities to attend college. That's where she met some artists who would prove to be crucial mentors, including Dakota media artist Mona Smith, who brought Shanai into Minneapolis's Healing Place Collaborative, a network of Native and non-Native folks dedicated to repairing the connection between peoples and the Mississippi River. Minneapolis is where Shanai co-created the first water bar. We'll hear a lot more about that in the interview itself. But she eventually returned to Aitkin County, where she started creating projects to encourage the rural communities of northern Minnesota to imagine a new relationship with the air, water, and soil on which they depend. She also joined the frontline protests against the building of the Line 3 oil pipeline and a nickel sulfide mine. Shanai spoke to me from a parking lot on the south side of Minneapolis, where she had stopped for an hour to chat with me. She was driving a pickup truck that was pulling a sculpture of hers. So naturally, I had to start off by asking her to tell me about the sculpture she was tugging behind her.
This is part of a project that has been multiple years in the making. I call it Overburden Overlook. It's a mobile mine view. And it's also a platform where we talk about lots of different things related to art, culture, community organizing, politics. So it's on a flatbed trailer that I pull behind a truck, and then I can host these pop-up conversations wherever I take it.
That's amazing. How long did it take you to develop that mobile aspect of the project?
So that aspect of the project really grew out of a couple of years of research and development work with a collaborator, Rupali Phadke, who's actually a social scientist. And she and I were working on a project together up on Minnesota's Iron Range, looking at the impacts of mining on environment, but also on community, economy, culture. And after having multiple art workshops and talking circles and focus groups with community members there, we developed this project that was an overlook for the overlooked, a way of talking about the stories, the connections to mining that don't get put on official memorial sites. If you drive across the Iron Range, or I would assume other mining impacted communities, you see these platforms that invite you to climb up and have a kind of commanding view of the landscape. And usually there's a plaque that tells you how much ore was extracted, what it was used for, which is usually about building cities or supporting military infrastructure or economic infrastructure. And those plaques rarely tell you the impact that mining had on the labor force or, some of the social histories. It doesn't usually tell you about how that mining impacted clean water or women, for instance. And so those were some of the threads that we encountered during that research that then became part of the project itself, which...
So you've created kind of a metaphoric platform to discuss these things that people see on the plaque on the literal platform.
Yeah. And, I bring the project around and I talk about some of my ways of doing this work, but then I also have tour guides who are members of the community where we are. Part of the project is to engage local guides. And so they're telling the stories that are overlooked. They're sharing their memories of the landscape and the changes to the culture and to the community that have come from extractive industries like mining. And, I've also used the platform to talk about other types of things too, but it was developed as a mine view to talk about mining.
Well, since your work is so closely intertwined into the fabric of your community, to the people and its resources and its ecology, I'd love it if you could describe where your home is, what it looks like, what the people are like.
Yeah, I grew up in rural Aitkin County, which is a county in north central Minnesota. It is geographically one of the larger counties in Minnesota. And I grew up in a town called Palisade, which has about 140 people in it. Many of them are my family. And that's the town where my mother was born and raised, where my grandmother was born and raised, and where my great grandmother and her husband settled. And so my family's been in the community for a number of generations. It's a very wet place. It's on the Mississippi River. And the Mississippi River has been a big part of my work and protecting water. I think because the place I grew up is so water rich and the ecology is very abundant.
Mhm.
I think people think of swamps and wetlands and lowlands, and they think of these kind of like waste, lonely places. And it's true that the population in Aitkin County is very sparse. It's considered a frontier county by the state of Minnesota, which means that the population density is so low that people there face unique challenges with access to healthcare or other services. But it is in fact a very abundant ecology. And the life there is really incredible. It's also Anishinaabe treaty territory, which is something that I didn't really understand or realize growing up, but have since come to some understanding of through my relationships with Indigenous artists and activists. But it's in 1855 treaty territory, and Anishinaabe people retain their inherent rights to hunt, fish, and gather in the territory. And so that's also
And
been
that's been true since 1855?
yeah,
Wow.
that was in the 1855 treaty. And
One of the few treaties apparently we didn't break.
yeah, well, I mean, some of the activist work that I've been a part of in the frontline struggles, for example, around the Line 3 oil pipeline or around the proposed nickel sulfide mine in Aitkin County, really makes it clear that although that is what is written into the treaties, that those treaty responsibilities are not being upheld by our United States government, and that Anishinaabe people are still struggling for their inherent rights to be recognized and honored, which is a big part of, a lot of the work that I do is really trying to understand for myself and also encourage others to understand what it means to be a settler, what our relationship is to treaties and to treaty lands, and also how to be accountable, how to join in and be a part of those struggles.
And because I don't know the history of the pipeline, what was the outcome? Was it built?
It was built. It was built very, very quickly. And as a result of the urgency with which they built this pipeline, there were a number of ecological impacts, such as the pipeline company Enbridge ended up puncturing several aquifers along the pipeline route, which meant that groundwater came welling up and was essentially lost into rivers and streams. They ended up fracking out, which means while they were drilling underneath rivers like the Mississippi and the Willow River, they spilled drilling fluids into the underground streams and aquifers, and that some of that came bubbling up to the surface. There were a number of those kinds of impacts. And they also faced a lot of resistance. It was a pretty big movement of people coming from all across the country to stand with Anishinaabe water protectors to try and stop the pipeline. And, although the pipeline wasn't stopped, it was built. I think that I know I personally learned a lot about arts and culture and community organizing in a rural community like that. Lessons
Can
that
you give me examples of what you learned from that experience?
One thing I learned was that it's a really difficult situation when you have a movement that is comprised of people who are primarily coming from somewhere else for a short period of time in order to participate in action. And then you have a local community, native and non-native people who have been living there who live there all year, who live there all the time, and the kind of disruption of the construction itself. So there were also thousands of workers who came to the community from all over the country. That was really challenging for local communities. And I don't think there was much organizing done in advance of that to try and involve local community members or to try to build movement on the ground where local people who might be opposed to the pipeline or opposed to rampant extraction, opposed to police abuses of power, where they would be invited to participate. It became very much like, I don't know quite how to describe it, but I learned that I want to be involved in long-term organizing. I don't want to be going from place to place and to communities where I don't know the ecology, I don't know the local people, and I want to be working in a place where I'm building relationships locally, and I'm helping to identify local leadership, and I'm encouraging local organizing. So for me, that was the big takeaway. And I decided most of the people who were involved in the Line 3 movement left the community after the pipeline was built. And I think that was also really hard for those activists and organizers who stay in the community because they suddenly were very isolated and alone. Again, feeling very abandoned. And so I decided I would stay and get more engaged. And so I started doing other types of community organizing in order to get to know more of my neighbors and build up some longer term mutual aid type of networks in the community.
Which is a tremendous amount of work, of course. So how does it fold into what you think of as your own artistic practice?
Yeah. I think my artistic practice has always really been about connecting with local places and stories and using the tools that I have available to me as an artist to try to bring some of those stories to the surface, to amplify overlooked or absent narrative, and to try to create spaces where people can connect with each other and can learn their own creative power or understand how participating in arts and culture projects builds a different sort of recognition in a community. And so I think more than anything, it was like all of the work that I had done with the Water Bar Project, with some of this research on the Iron Range, with media and storytelling, I brought that home. And I've been working to try to put those tools and strategies into the hands of local artists and organizers.
You mentioned the Water Bar, so I want to make sure we understand exactly what that is. So the Water Bar precedes your move back home, is that correct?
Yes, the Water Bar Project, I don't even remember when it began. It had so many permutations. That's one thing about my work is that it's very emergent. I don't have like a start and stop.
Like a fountain or a stream, since we're hewing to metaphors, maybe.
Yes. And so the Water Bar Project started in Minneapolis when my collaborator, Colin Klecker, and we were like, what can we do to get people to understand that they are intimately connected to the Mississippi River? And we thought, okay, what if we took water directly out of the river and we put it through a filtration system, and then we created a little speakeasy where we served that filtered water to people and had conversations about what's going on with the river, what are the impacts of pollution or upstream industry. And then we started talking to scientists that we knew and people who were involved in water issues, and we shared this idea, and they were like, you know that the city of Minneapolis already does that. That's what your tap water is. And I was like, whoa. Like, I think I knew that Minneapolis got its drinking water from the Mississippi, but it never occurred to me that that would be something to organize around. And so,
sure, the fact that you didn't know it means that most Minneapolis did not know, right?
Yeah. And, over time, I came to realize most people don't know where their water comes from.
Mm-hmm.
They think that, they turn on the tap, and if they're fortunate enough, if they aren't living in a place where the water infrastructure has been decimated, which that is also something I realized. There's a lot of those places. But if you turn on your tap, clean water comes out and you don't really need to think about it. Or you don't trust the tap water. And so your drinking water comes from a plastic bottle that you buy at the store.
Right.
And so most people don't really get much deeper than that. And so we started to think of the project as a platform where people could be offered free drinking water samples taken, gathered from different communities. And the menu for the water bar would tell you where that water was gathered, from which municipality or spring or well, and whether it was groundwater or surface water, and the name of that surface water source, like the Mississippi River or Lake Superior. And then we would just offer that to people in a similar way to, coming up to a bar and ordering a tasting flight. And then while they were tasting, we would have all kinds of conversations. And the conversations would really meander based on what water we were serving, but also who we had behind the bar. And so initially I was thinking like we were the bartenders, artists.
Uh-huh.
But pretty quickly we learned that it was much more powerful to have other people behind the bar serving the water, like geologists who could tell us about groundwater, activists who were fighting for clean water in their communities, people who had really interesting professional connections to water. And so we started to think of the bartending aspect of Water Bar as almost like its own community space where we would learn together. And so we started partnering with different organizations to do these water bartender trainings where we would do kind of like night school for bartenders. but it was learning about the sources of water and the contaminants and the risks and the stories of the people who are impacted by that. And, I think over the course of the last 8 years, I've probably Water Bar itself has served thousands of people. Like we ended up doing a water bar at the Minnesota State Fair where we served 25,000 people each year.
Wow. So
For 3
you've
years.
got a mobile setup.
Yeah, we ended up having a mobile setup. We ended up developing a pop-up kit that is still being used by other organizations. We ended up opening a storefront space for a couple of years where we had a water bar that people could come and visit, and we used that as a studio and community gathering space. And then we inspired a number of municipalities across the country to open their own water bar projects. So the city of Philadelphia has a water bar that's based on our work. The city of Minneapolis has used some of our strategies in their own education and engagement. And we ended up joining the U.S. Water Alliance and working with water advocates across the country to try to develop ways that arts and culture strategies can help encourage education, engagement, and empowerment around water equity.
Do you get a sense that the communities or the people that have been able to enjoy the water bar, that they're able to effect policy change, that they're writing to their representatives, that there's a groundswell of change?
I think that has happened in some cases, but I think the other way that policy change happens through projects like Water Bar is that we actually got the policymakers to step behind the bar.
Oh, great.
And that was not something that I had planned. Like when we initially started the project, I thought artists would be behind the bar. But we ended up having our governor, Tim Walz, and Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan actually step behind the bar at one point during a pop-up that we did in collaboration with the Minnesota State, the agency, the Public Health Department. Sorry, so many acronyms. But, by inviting policymakers to step behind the bar and to be in a role of literally serving their constituents water and to listen to the stories that people had, not just like how they had experienced, a water crisis, but really the questions that they had and the way that they did not trust the government to protect our health in a lot of cases. Like that was a big part of the conversation is like, why do we not trust our tap water? And one reason is that in a lot of cities, in a lot of communities, you can't drink the tap water because the infrastructure has been so underfunded and it hasn't been cared for. And there are these deep disparities. And so by
Right,
putting
like in Flint, Michigan, and I'm sure there's
yeah,
plenty of other examples, right?
yeah, Flint is a great example. There's also a lot of communities, a lot of Native communities across the country on reservations. The infrastructure has not been funded, and that's a very intentional way that the United States government has kept Indigenous people in that position of precarity. There's a lot of that. And by putting policymakers behind the bar, we actually are involving them in a different way in understanding their work. And I do think that that has led to different changes. And not just policymakers, but the people who work for those public agencies, the organizers who work for advocacy groups. I mean, it has given them a very different way of connecting with community. And I think that's where the power is of these projects.
What advice would you have for an artist in a rural community somewhere else in the country who thinks, oh, I should do a version of the water bar, or I should do a version of the Overlook Overburden Mines project? What would be the most crucial piece of advice you could give her?
Well, all of the projects that I do, like Water Bar or this mobile mine view, I work with so many people, I collaborate on them. And so that by the time they come to life, I never think of them as mine. I think of them I think of them as if they belong to the people. And so if somebody hears about one of these projects and wants to replicate it, change it, do it in their own way, I encourage that 100%. Nobody needs to reach out to me to ask for my permission. They just can, hopefully I've put enough out into the world that will help them learn something that will help them do that. And I also love to see when people do those things. Like I get photos sometimes like, hey, I'm doing a water bar over here. And I love that. So I would say that about those projects. But the other thing is that, don't underestimate the power of your artwork and your community work to help other people imagine new worlds. Because I think that in addition to the dismantling of government, to the fear mongering that's happening right now in all of our places, there's also this dispiriting, like, discouragement. This idea that, like, nothing we do matters, like, we're not going to be able to fight these monsters. And I think that losing hope and not imagining a different world is what is going to stop us from creating it. It's like we can't create something different if we don't even imagine it. And so artists are the artists and culture bearers and people who create spaces for that. They are the ones who have to help us imagine, a different direction. And I think that is really, really important, and it's hard. And so persistence, not perfection. Like I think about how many times I've tried things that didn't work. And how, I early on when I was doing this kind of arts organizing work, I would get really down. Like I would crash out every time I had an event. Even if it went well, I would feel this feeling of like, oh my God, that didn't go the way I imagined it. That person didn't show up. Like there weren't that many people there. I was running around instead of being present, and I would get really down on myself. But over time, I've really tried to let go of those kinds of judgments and just be in the space and know that it's not perfect. Nothing is perfect, but you're showing people a different way of doing things, and you're giving them a chance to be in that space. And over time, I have seen it transform not only individuals, but relationships and communities. And people get braver and they get more connected, and they start to understand that the resources and tools that we need are here. We just need to figure out how to access them, and we need to be brave enough to use them, even when there are all kinds of signals telling us that we can't do that. And so I think persistence and showing up, that number one, just showing up for your community and showing up for yourself too, and making sure that you're not, giving everything at the expense of some of the core relationships that you need to survive and be well.
And lastly, looking out over the next year, if it doesn't send you into a panic, uh, what, what I know you're lugging around this current project. behind your pickup. But is there any new project or ongoing project or event that you're really particularly looking forward to?
Yes, I am excited about the work that I'm doing with Annie Humphrey at Fire in the Village. I didn't talk much about that, but
Mm.
Annie is also an artist, a mother, a grandmother. She's Anishinaabe from the Leech Lake Reservation, and she is a student of John Trudell, who was Indigenous poet, philosopher, musician, artist. And she's really carrying John's legacy forward, and she's helping the next generation of Native and non-Native artists and activists really come into their power. And I've been working really closely with Annie to figure out how we bridge between the Native and non-Native communities in our rural region, which is, not just Aitkin County, but Anishinaabe territory across northern Minnesota. And so, we're going out and we're doing a lot of pop-ups, we're doing printmaking, we're teaching art and music, but we're also always demonstrating a different way of gathering and how we call it Fire in the Village because it is that fire that we all tend to both within ourselves and as a community that is like a light in the darkness. If we all tend to our little fires, then we can go over here and recognize this is what's happening in this community and this is what's happening here. And this is how we support each other. And I really feel like that is one recipe for how we are going to survive the collapse of capitalism and the emergence of something that is hopefully much better, much more caring, much more place-based and aware of its dependency on the earth and the water and the animals and other people.
If you'd like to read a longer version of this interview, in which we discuss the importance of self-care, something that Shanai admittedly has yet to fully put into practice, given how busy she is, just head to uncsa.edu/artrestart. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean the world to me if you shared it with a friend you think would like it as well. We rely on your word of mouth to reach new listeners. And always, don't forget to subscribe or follow wherever you listen to us. Our theme music is by Shanghai Restoration Project. I'm Pier Carlo Talenti, and on behalf of the Keenan Institute for the Arts, thanks for listening.